Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a foundational American law. It's one most people have probably heard of, but maybe don't fully grasp. The Posse Comitatus Act. This deep dive is really all about understanding this crucial legal barrier, the one designed to keep the military out of our everyday civilian lives.
Exactly. And we'll explore it's a quite surprising historical roots. We'll look at how it embodies this deep-seated American skepticism towards, unchecked military power, and why its principles are still so fiercely debated and sometimes, frankly, bypassed today. It's a cornerstone, but one that seems to constantly shift.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So our mission today is to unpack its origins, its core purpose, look at some really fascinating and vital exceptions, and of course the modern challenges it faces. This isn't just about some dusty old law, right? It's about this ever-present tension between security and liberty in our society. Okay, let's unpack this. So at its core, the Posse Comitatus Act, enacted way back in 1878, it stands as this really critical legal barrier. It explicitly prevents the president, generally speaking, from using federal military forces for domestic law enforcement purposes. It's all about maintaining a clear, almost sacred distinction between military roles and civilian roles and responsibilities.
Right, and this legislation, it really embodies a profound, long-standing American principle. It's, you could say, rooted in the very DNA of the nation. It reflects the founders' deep apprehension about military power being leveraged against citizens, against their rights. What's fascinating here, I think, is that it underscores this enduring commitment to civil liberties and, importantly, government accountability, making sure that the armed forces, which are incredibly powerful, don't overreach into our daily lives.
And what's almost ironic, isn't it, is that the act designed to keep the military out actually bears the name Posse Comitatus, which literally refers to a group of civilians mobilized by a sheriff to uphold local law. It's a term of civilian power, not military power.
Exactly. That alone tells you something fundamental about the core philosophy behind it.
Absolutely.
And, that historical skepticism regarding military involvement, it isn't some abstract concept. It traces all the way back to the colonial era. American settlers had a very direct and often quite painful experience with an oppressive military presence imposed by British authorities, especially after the French and Indian War. They knew firsthand what it felt like to have an armed force sort of dictating terms and enforcing unpopular laws right there in civilian life.
And what's truly fascinating is how that historical distrust isn't just an abstract idea floating around, it's explicitly written into the U.S. Constitution itself.
Right, into the text.
Take the Third Amendment, for instance. It explicitly prohibits the quartering of soldiers in private homes without the owner's consent. I mean, that's a direct response to those British practices where they stationed troops in American homes before the Revolution, basically to enforce unpopular laws. Can you even imagine that today?
No, it's hard to fathom. And that protective impulse, it definitely extended beyond just, not having soldiers in your living room. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments were also established to safeguard individuals against arbitrary government actions.
Okay.
They guarantee protection from unreasonable searches and seizures, the right to due process, the right to a fair trial, all these crucial rights. And these amendments, they collectively emerged from that historical context, one rife with British abuses, where the military often served as the enforcer of the Crown's will, rather than, say, a protector of the populace.
So the colonists really came to this profound realization: the military should not operate as a law enforcement entity, period. They feared both outright oppression and just a dangerous erosion of civil liberties. It became a foundational belief.
But this is where the Act's legacy gets, quite complex. While the Posse Comitatus Act was indeed meant to prevent federal military interference in civilian affairs, its timing is critical. It was enacted right after the end of Reconstruction, precisely when federal troops were withdrawing from the South.
Ah, right. And this led to a critical and truly tragic unintended consequence, didn't it? While the law aimed to keep federal troops out of civilian matters, it paradoxically created this vacuum.
This huge vacuum.
Federal forces could no longer intervene to protect black citizens from horrific violence and widespread disenfranchisement that was happening. And this effectively allowed white supremacist governments to rapidly reassert control. They implemented highly restrictive black codes and later the whole pervasive system of Jim Crow laws.
Yeah, It's a really stark reminder that simply limiting federal power doesn't automatically translate into universal liberty or protection for everyone. Sometimes it does the opposite.
A very sobering point. Now, despite this robust barrier that the Act creates, it isn't absolute, right? There are crucial situations where military action is permitted, sometimes even necessary.
Correct.
And the most prominent example, the one that carries immense power, is the Insurrection Act.
Ah, yes, the Insurrection Act. It's a powerful, some might say even frighteningly powerful law. It essentially empowers the president to mobilize troops domestically under specific, quite dire circumstances. Things like facing an actual insurrection, or, importantly, when state governments fail or refuse to fulfill their duty to uphold civil rights protections for their citizens.
So it's like a federal backstop for fundamental rights, using the military if needed.
In a sense, yes. It's a significant power that bypasses the usual Posse Comitatus restrictions, but it is meant for very specific, very serious situations.
And the real impact of the Insurrection Act, maybe the best way to understand it is through a powerful moment in our history. Back in 1957, President Dwight D. Eisenhower faced this defining challenge in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Iraq 9.
Exactly. He invoked the Insurrection Act, he dispatched federal troops, the 101st Airborne actually, to Little Rock, and their mission: to ensure that Central High School would finally open its doors to all students, regardless of race. This was in direct defiance of the state governor's opposition. It was a clear, quite dramatic reaffirmation of the federal commitment to civil rights enforced by the military.
A landmark moment. And it shows the intended positive potential of bypassing Posse Comitatus specifically for civil rights protection. So how do these historical principles and these exceptions hold up against more modern challenges?
That's the big question now, isn't it?
It is, because recent events, particularly thinking about 2020 and 2021, really threw a spotlight on what some see as significant loopholes within this legal framework.
Loopholes, yeah.
Gaps regarding military involvement in domestic issues. And this raises an important question. Have we sort of inadvertently created new pathways for military involvement that might undermine the Act's original intent?
It certainly felt that way to many people watching the news. We saw President Donald Trump activate the D.C. National Guard, and he urged governors to deploy their National Guard troops to Washington, D.C. under something called Title 32 status.
Title 32.
And this maneuver, it essentially allowed him to bypass some of the customary restrictions on deploying federal troops domestically. It led to a very visible military presence in cities during protests.
Right. And to clarify maybe how Title 32 status functions as a kind of workaround,
Yeah.
it's historically been a bit of a murky legal territory. It allows federal funding and federal equipping of National Guard deployments, often for federal interests or missions. But, and here's the critical distinction, the troops remain under state command and control.
So they aren't technically federal troops in the way the Act usually means.
Exactly. They aren't federally activated under Title 10, which would clearly trigger the Posse Comitatus Act restrictions. So Title 32 is seen by some as a clever way to blur those lines that the Act tries so hard to draw. It effectively creates a pathway for domestic military deployments without, arguably, a direct violation of the letter of the law.
Okay, so while the Posse Comitatus Act clearly intends to protect constitutional freedoms, these built-in limitations, especially regarding the National Guard's kind of dual state-federal role, they present significant challenges for modern leadership.
They really do.
It's like building a strong fence but leaving maybe a deliberately ambiguous side gate open.
That's a pretty good analogy. And that's precisely why historical events, like using federal troops during critical civil rights moments, and also the more recent fervent demonstrations, perhaps against police violence, they continue to highlight this ongoing, really intense discussion about military participation in domestic matters. We're constantly negotiating this boundary, it seems.
Yeah, this is clearly not a settled issue, not by a long shot. The tension between civil liberties and national security, or between federal power and state autonomy, it's something we continue to grapple with as a society.
Constantly.
And it plays out directly in how we interpret and apply laws like the Posse Comitatus Act today.
Wow, what a deep dive into the Posse Comitatus Act. It's clearly a law that's both a cornerstone of our democracy and at the same time a source of ongoing vital debate.
Absolutely. And perhaps something for you, the listener, to reflect on is how this historical tension, this push and pull between civilian control and military power, continues to shape events right now, today. And maybe think about how defining key terms like insurrection or civil rights protections or even law enforcement function can lead to vastly different interpretations of the Act's application. It's a truly vital area to keep exploring because it directly impacts the balance of power and ultimately our freedoms in society.